Hello, everyone. My name is Andrew, and welcome back to Frames of Space. Today's guest is Cathy Reisenwitz, who is a journalist who currently writes the Substack Sex and the State. This episode in particular explores her own personal journey and focuses on how her upbringing in a strict evangelical environment gave her very rigid views on things like sex or morality. But as life unfolded, her perspectives evolved, leading her to embrace a very different worldview on many different cultural facets. So yeah, this conversation is another exploration of gender. But I found it particularly fascinating because of the unique insights into how people's views change over time. Throughout my time hosting this podcast, I've been trying to get on guests whose views have, on like any contentious topic, have changed over time as a direct result of personal experience. One recent example of this would be my episode with Eric Engheim about how his own views on Trump supporters changed over time and how that affected the way that he sees them. Today's episode is about how someone's views on things like sex and culture have changed over time. Cathy, in this episode, speaks quite candidly about her own transition from a rigid worldview to one that values things like justice and autonomy a lot more than it values things like strict adherence to the rules. So we talk a lot about her experiences with things like sex work and how her views on pornography have evolved. We also talk a lot about her experiences and how they inform our broader understanding of cultural topics in society. And I tried my best to navigate this conversation with both curiosity and a willingness to challenge assumptions in order to get to the heart of these often contentious topics. So, hope you enjoy. Cathy Reisenwitz, thank you so much for taking the time to come onto this podcast.
Thank you so much for inviting me, Andrew. I really have enjoyed what I've heard of your show, and I'm excited to speak with you.
So to begin, I just wanted to ask you, could you talk about your history growing up as an evangelical and how that affected your views on things like sex?
Oh my golly. Yeah, for sure. I mean, there's a lot to say, obviously. So just, I guess, interrupt me if I'm going too far on one thing and ask follow questions if I haven't said enough about another. But I don't know. I think there's an extent to which the people who are kind of in charge of things have grown up in a very different environment than I grew up in. And that I think the way that I grew up is a lot more similar when it comes to sex and gender to the way the average American has grown up than the people who lead media, academia, business, like all those things. And so what I would say is I was brought up in a culture that was very explicit about a lot of things that I think are kind of implicitly understood by most people. What I mean by that is I was told explicitly that, it's okay for women to work, but ideally, a woman gets married to a man, stays married for life, has his children, and makes that her primary concern and occupation. I was told explicitly that men in the home are the leaders of the home, and that women are helpmeets to men, and that is ordained by God and correct. I was told explicitly that gay sex is wrong, and that gay marriage is wrong, and that sex outside of marriage is wrong, and, just all these things that I think a lot of people kind of, to one extent or another, implicitly believe, but maybe didn't hear as explicitly. And I have a hard time half-assing things, and so I believed these things very strongly
Wait,
until
just to be clear, like you say, you had a hard time half-assing things. So maybe the way I would phrase it would be like some of your peers had more like comfortability like beating around the bush or like bending the rules in a way that you didn't feel like.
Right. They had an easier time with nuance and with yeah, they would say premarital sex is a sin, but then do it. Or like their friends would do it and it's like not that big a deal. Whereas for me, it's like, well, this is wrong, so I'm not going to do it. And when my friends do it, I'm going to tell them that they're wrong. It was a very black and white, literal situation, and I did not understand people who saw and did things differently. And so I really lived these values to the extent that I was capable for a long time. And then I rejected them, and it became clear to me how much harm this, what I would call sex negativity, which is moralizing around sex, that did me a lot of harm, and it does a lot of people a lot of harm. Even people who don't fully buy into it, these narratives about what's right for men and right for women and the right way to have sex is just really destructive. And so that's really animated a lot of my work in a way that I think is really confusing to people who grow up in like, I don't know, the Upper East Side of Manhattan or the Bay Area, where they and their parents are highly educated and the situation they find themselves in is very progressive. When they hear stories about, you know, going to abstinence camp and being likened to a piece of tape, and, you know, a woman is a piece of tape, and the more you stick on, which is sex, then, you know, it loses its stickiness and that's its value. Like it sounds insane because it is insane, but it's also very normal, unfortunately, outside of these kind of liberal, highly educated enclaves. And so that's been a huge impact on me. And it's why my newsletter is called Sex and the State, because I'm really interested in sex and politics. It's all, you know, the kind of through line is justice, autonomy, power, these things.
I am curious if that is the way that you grew up. I do want to ask you, like, if you don't mind me asking, what changed about you? Like, what were the pivotal moments that caused you to sort of like reprogram your brain, if that makes sense? Like, and also what was it like to go to liberal enclaves for the first time?
Yeah. I would say, I mean, all stories are made up and who knows, but when I look back, the story I tell myself revolves around three pivotal experiences. The first was when my sister came out of the closet. My sister is a lesbian, and I was homophobic. Like we both were. We were taught to be homophobic. And, you know, she obviously got through that more quickly than I did, thank God. But um, it did make me wonder, like, why is it okay for me to have a sexual relationship and not my sister because she's a lesbian? Like, where's the logic in that? Like, how is it hurting anybody for her to marry a woman versus me marrying a man? Like, that doesn't make any sense. Um, but I still wasn't ready to throw out the whole moralizing around sex. I was just confused. And then I remember my friend in college took me to her Sunday school, and the person running the Sunday school class said women aren't supposed to teach men like Bible stuff. And I was like, I mean, I grew up Southern Baptist. It's not like I had a female preacher at any point in my life. And being a woman, I was led by men and women in church. So I guess I never really thought about like, is it okay for like a male child to have a female Sunday school teacher? It's not a question I'd ever asked myself. And so they pointed to the verse in the Bible where Paul says, I don't permit a woman to be over a man. And I was like, well, I mean, that is what the Bible says. And the Bible is supposed to be inerrant word of God. So, but that's weird. I don't know. What do people on the internet say about this? And so I looked it up. And people pointed out that, like, well, Paul also said women should keep their heads covered in church, and we're not still doing that. So why would this gender thing be? And then the concept of like these are letters written to specific churches at a specific time. And I took a biblical perspectives class in college as well. And I'd spent my whole life in church, gone 3 times a week, like gone to camp, true believer. And I never learned what the Bible actually is, like how it came together, what influenced it from a literary perspective, like any of that. And so that was enlightening. And then I wanted to leave my husband. And that was the final kind of thing. And so I really wanted him to go to couples therapy. I thought our problems could be overcome. He would only see our pastor and his wife. We sat down with our pastor and his wife, and they only wanted to talk about my relationship with Jesus as opposed to the actual problems in our marriage. And I realized, like, they're in their minds, the only thing that matters is keeping this marriage together. Not my happiness, not what we can do for the world separately or together. Like, no other consideration is more important than keeping this marriage together. We didn't have any kids, by the way. So, like, it, again, that just makes it extra, like, strange, hard to justify on any rational basis, this concern for whether we stay married or get divorced. So then it was like, okay, do I believe this stuff enough to spend the rest of my life married to a man who I know I really don't need to be married to? And I thought long and hard about it, and I was like, no, 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 I don't. So that really set me off of like, okay, I'm not using the Bible or Christianity as an ethical guide anymore. Like, that's just not what I'm doing. I think that what the evangelical church has taught me, particularly about sex and relationships, is unethical. I think when I believed that to a greater extent and lived it, I was a less ethical person than I am now. So yeah, that was kind of set that in motion.
I think this is really fascinating. One of the things that you said that struck out to me is when you mentioned that you thought that, like, back when you were like a very devout, like, evangelical, you think that you were less ethical than you are right now. So what, if you don't mind me asking, what undergirds your current ethical framework?
Vibes. I mean, I think every framework is too
Rigid?
yeah. Well, yeah, they're too flawed to be applied rigidly. Unfortunately, I love a system, believe me. I mean, that's why I spent so much time in evangelical Christianity. It's why I was attracted to libertarianism. It's why I got into anarcho-capitalism. Like, a system is very appealing to me. And so if I could find one that didn't, when rigidly applied, not have flaws that made it, really unworkable. I tend toward utilitarianism, I would say, but obviously, like, you can take that way too far in such a way that it just feels yucky to me. But
Yeah.
yeah, I mean, like, I guess the way that I justify things is often on a utilitarian basis, like homophobia. I think homophobia is more unethical than gay sex because homophobia hurts people and gay sex doesn't. Like, it's kind of like you can make it really complicated, but I try not to.
Yeah. But I guess when you talk about how, like, you spend a lot of time trying to lean towards, like, a sense of rigidity, because, like, obviously rigidity, even if, like, it might be ethical, it might be unethical, but I do think people gravitate towards it because it gives them a clear sense of structure. It gives them a clear sense of, like, who they should be, how they should act. Like, it gives them a very clear sense of what right and wrong is, where, like us looking from the outside in, it might seem completely insane, but to them, like, it is so stress relieving to have a system that, like, very clearly tells you what's right and wrong at any given time.
Oh, for sure. And I miss it every day. Every day, I wish I had some system to tell me how to be a good person and how to make decisions and what to do. It's beautiful. It's comforting.
Yeah.
it's safe. It feels safe. It's not, but it feels safe. I remember I was listening to a podcast about a woman who grew up in the Goddard, not the Bill Gothard cult.
Oh
And these
yeah, that.
parents,
Yeah, keep
yeah,
going.
her parents had like really bought into the Gothard bull crap. And she said, and I think this ties into, Dumez's Jesus and John Wayne and, a lot of stuff about how in a situation in which a lot of people were raising kids outside of their extended family, like with physical and emotional distance from their extended families, um, without like having inherited access to a faith community, without access to like an immigrant community, without that, these parents were really adrift as far as how to raise their children. They really didn't know how to do it. And so Bill Gothard saying, I will tell you exactly how to do it. I will tell you how to dress. I will tell you how to eat. I will tell you how to discipline. I will tell you which extracurriculars to do. Like all of that was very attractive to these parents. And that made a lot of sense to me and gave me a lot of empathy for the people who get sucked into that kind of thing, where it's a big question and people want to get it right. And so any answer is kind of better or feels better in the moment than having to make these decisions on your own and figure it out yourself.
Yeah, and if you make those decisions on your own and you figure it out for yourself, maybe you feel like it's on you, like if you made a mistake. Maybe you feel like it's
Totally.
yeah. You feel like it's your fault that like you screwed something up, whereas like if you're relying on someone else's value system, if you're relying on someone else's structure, then in a way you like even if it's not true, you get to tell yourself that like you can't be held accountable if you do the wrong thing because it's just what you were told.
Well, and you can't be doing the wrong thing because even if everything tells you it's the wrong thing, all of the evidence, all of your personal experience, common sense, research, well, it's God. God told me. God says this is right. And so I'm going to ignore all of that. And that's what evangelicism is really big on is you are supposed to ignore all of that and do whatever, God as expressed through this guy's interpretation of the Bible says to do.
There's one quote that you said in one of your articles that I thought was kind of fascinating, so I'm going to quote it right now. Quote, there's a small part of me, a part that used to be bigger, that loves the idea of someone coming in and just cutting everything down and starting over. Elon Musk is just a tanky whose accidental self-immolation is happening in public and in slow motion. He's teenage Cathy bringing home a "Don't just rebel, start a revolution" bumper sticker and not understanding why her mom lost her shit. You put me in public school in Alabama. Of course, I didn't know any history. End quote. Yeah, could you talk about that and how that might be like reflective of the way that a lot of people feel when it comes to that like impulse to burn everything down because of the way that they were raised?
Oh man, cheesy Louise. I mean, I don't know how everyone doesn't feel this way. Um, oh God, where to even begin? I mean, the most recent example is like I was on a pod where I did a Substack live. It was my first Substack live, and I was talking to people from it's called The Rebuild. And I was saying about how I don't like the idea of um, investing in particular communities versus, like, to me, the history of the United States is one of the growth and decline of various parts of the country. A mining town will happen, and then the mines will get emptied, and then it'll become a ghost town, and people will move on to where the economic opportunity is. And like that just seems really, obviously like economically most efficient, but also environmentally most efficient to when the resources run out, and it starts costing more to maintain a place than the place is producing to move to where opportunity is, which is increasingly in cities in the United States, which are engines of growth and more environmentally friendly, and more egalitarian. Like there are many, many reasons to prefer people live in cities than to, keep them in dying towns. So that's my preference. It's most efficient to get to where I think we all kind of want to be, is to just allow towns to take their natural course. But the man of the two people I was speaking to, Gary, I think, was like, well, that's not politically popular. Let your town die is not a winning political slogan. And so, yeah, like I totally understand the desire to like get rid of the Department of Homeland Security, for example, and whatever functions it actually needs to perform, start over with a new organization that does those functions, and let the functions it was doing that don't need to happen anymore not happen anymore, right? Like that's just like an efficient way to do things, provided you have the political, legal, everything authority to get those things done. And so I don't know. I think that I have not been tested or diagnosed, but I believe I'm on the spectrum. And one of the things that is true of people on the spectrum is they tend to be black and white thinkers. They tend to like things to be done in ways that seem efficient to them. And that very much resonates with me. It's one thing that drew me to libertarianism and anarcho-capitalism. It just seemed efficient. And there's something just so maddeningly unsatisfying about a vibes-based ethical system, about having to do things incrementally, having to build consensus, having to balance different needs, and it's repulsive to me in a deep way to have to do these things. But then there's the higher order, like, well, it's actually more efficient to do something than to advocate for a perfect solution that will never be implemented. And so
Yeah, it's more efficient to advocate for incremental change than to just tear down the whole system.
right. So that's where I am now.
Yeah.
A moderate Democrat.
Yeah. Let's go back a little bit to when you were talking about what it was like growing up and some of the things that caused you to change from the more rigid worldview that you had in the past. So obviously you talked about how like you had a sister who was lesbian, or like the time that you ended your marriage, and like all of that like had a cumulative effect of like you turning away from like the curve, like conservative evangelicalism that you grew up in. So like what are some ways that you would say that your life has changed, and what are some things that you've changed about the world in addition to like having less of a rigid structure?
Well, I'm a sex worker. I don't think that would have been true if I had stayed in evangelical Christianity, though who knows? So, again, people who are more comfortable with nuance are able to justify all kinds of things, but I would have had to become a lot more chill of an evangelical Christian to be able to justify that. Yeah, I mean, I got divorced. I moved to DC. Oh, you had asked me earlier about what it was like to move to the coasts. I was definitely like really nervous moving from Alabama to DC about being seen as a Southern person, as an evangelical Christian. I assumed that people would assume that I'm closed-minded and stupid and poorly educated and like all these things that, I kind of associated with the South and with evangelical Christianity, and that aren't entirely untrue, uh, um, on average. But then when I got to DC, I found the people I was around, a lot more open-minded and a lot less stereotyping than I expected, but also, like I said, just a lot more ignorant. Like a lot of people just really didn't know how, the insane things that I was taught growing up. So that was a relief and also really interesting. One of the first things I noticed when I was in DC, and it really hit home in the Bay Area, was I really thought that everybody was obsessed with sex and just didn't talk about it because I was obsessed with sex. And the churches I grew up in, the leaders were really obsessed with sex. We talked about it all the time. um, and so I just thought that was everybody. And then I started talking to people who didn't grow up in situations in which the adults in their lives, didn't talk about sex all the time. And when they did talk about it, it was like fact-based and helpful and not shaming. And they just were genuinely like not really that interested in it, like comparatively. They were just like, yeah, it's a thing I do and I like it, or I'm not that into it or whatever. But it just wasn't this big damn deal for them in the way it was for me and many of the adults around me. And they weren't lying. Like they weren't hiding anything. There was no need for them to lie or hide because it wasn't shameful for them. And so that was really shocking to me and really solidified in my heart and mind that we are just really screwing everyone over when we moralize around sex. It doesn't need to happen, and that people are much healthier when we don't.
Yeah. Are there like specific views on sex that you've like done like a 180 on as a result of your time like
All of
moving?
them. Name one.
All right. I don't know, premarital sex.
Love it.
Yeah. Okay, so you like literally all of them. Um, like how promiscuous you are like allowed like you should be encouraged to be.
No, well, see, to me, that's a really common misconception. So I'm so glad you said that. Because when we talk about sex negativity and sex positivity, we assume that that means the view that sex is good versus the view that sex is bad. Totally normal. But actually, what it means is sex is inherently morally anything versus sex is inherently morally neutral. So sex negative means there's a universal moral ideology around sex, and the moralities differ from person to person and context to context. But it's the idea that there's a right way and a wrong way to do sex. And when I say right and wrong, I don't mean just like more fun and less fun. I mean morally, ethically right way to do sex. So maybe in some people's view, BDSM is always morally incorrect, and another it's gay sex or it's sex before marriage or whatever. And sex negativity, so that's sex negativity. Sex positivity is, it just says sex is defined as adult and consensual. And so anything that is sex proper is morally fine. It's not good or bad. It's not preferable or avoidable. It's just whatever the person wants it to be. And so promiscuity under a sex positive framework is not preferable. It's not good, but it's also not bad. It's not shameful. It's not immoral. It's not unethical.
Are there any forms of consensual sex that you think society should encourage more or stigmatize more?
No. Should I?
I would no. I would. Have you read Christine Emba's recent book about rethinking sex, about how like consent is the floor, but it shouldn't be the ceiling?
I have not read it. I meant to and then didn't.
Oh.
Yeah, I mean, I think people should have sex that's more pleasurable. But I think this is a kind of a semantic argument because it depends on what you define as consent. And I think that one of the things I really like about sex positive feminism is that consent is the beginning of the conversation, not the end. So we really, again, we love black and white. We love a dichotomy. We love simplicity. We love a framework. And so to say sex is either consensual or non-consensual, it's very simple and it's very comforting. But the reality is that consent is a spectrum, not a binary. that, and this is true for consent broadly, not just around sex, not even especially around sex, but like if I'm desperate for a job and the only one available or the first one available is exploitative, well, I've consented, sure, but under duress. It's not the same kind of consent as if I have a bunch of really attractive options that I choose among them, right? The more information I have, the more consensual a decision is. And so, yeah, pleasure is just one of the many facets that we take into consideration when we consider whether sex is truly and fully consensual.
Um, do you think that there are any kinds? All right. So like I think I mostly agree. I might quibble around like the margins. But in like how about this? Do you think that there are any kinds of fully consensual sex that society should encourage more or stigmatize more? Or do you think that's still too much of like an absolute binary?
Yeah, I don't know. I think, is there something you're getting at? Yeah, I would like to more fully understand the question. Like what's an example?
So like we brought up the example of premarital sex. What
Sure.
about like do you think that there are specific like what do you like what about like age gaps? Do you think that there's like a specific like age gap between two consenting adults at which point like even if it's legal we should try to like we as a society should try to stigmatize it a little bit more?
Mm, no. No, because it doesn't work. Not only does stigmatizing sex not actually get people to do things differently, but it causes all kinds of problems in the interim. So it's similar to like if you look at abstinence only sex education versus medically accurate comprehensive sex education. So that's sex education that incorporates discussions of consent and pleasure. There is less sexual assault and fewer STIs and fewer unintended pregnancies, and the average person has their sexual debut at a later age with medically accurate, comprehensive sex education than abstinence only sex education, which means stigmatizing and shaming sex not only does not get people to have less sex or safer sex, it actually results in them having sex earlier and in a less safe way. So, no, I don't think that we should stigmatize sex to make it better or safer. I think that, like so many things, like sex is downstream of a lot of other things. And so when it comes to abuse, um, what we're seeing is that it's downstream of power discrepancies. And so what I would like to see in terms of age gap relationships would be people who are more equally empowered um, going into relationships. And I think that the reason that consent education helps reduce rates of sexual violence is because it helps people understand consent, and that consent is, among other things, a result of more equal power differentials. And so that's how I would prefer. I don't think an age gap is a problem in and of itself. I think a power differential opens up opportunity for abuse. And that's what we should focus on. And that's what we need to talk about. And that's what we need to educate people on.
So one thing that you said that I thought was really fascinating is like the idea that like the age gap itself doesn't like isn't as important as like the power differential, and like maybe the framework that would be important as a result would be to like have people that like both feel empowered, and then if I were to add something, they also feel like more explicitly encouraged to be like explicit about what their desires are. um
Exactly. So when you're talking about pleasure, why are people having sex that they don't find pleasurable? Or why are they having sex that could be more pleasurable but isn't?
because
Power, education,
well I
right?
think
Because they don't feel empowered.
I would agree that it's power. I would also say maybe some of it is also like fear of embarrassment, where maybe there are some times where there is no power differential, but you're still afraid of speaking up because you're afraid of you're afraid that you might get embarrassed or that maybe that fear would still be there even if there was no power differential. And during those times, we should encourage them to be more explicit about their desires. Do you think? All right, how do you want to go down the list of other things that you may have changed your mind about?
I mean, whew, it's a long list. So yeah, I mean,
Yeah,
whatever.
we could be here all day.
Yeah.
All right, how have your views on pornography, changed?
Oh my golly. Oh my gosh. I mean, I was very anti-porn. In fact, I remember I had a friend in high school who I met at the abstinence retreat, funnily enough, and she did not grow up evangelical, lucky her. And we were debating about porn, and I remember emailing her and just being like, porn is bad for all these reasons. Like, because I've been told that porn is bad. Like, I've been told that porn, um, makes men not able to be attracted to their wives because they compare their wives to these girls and the wives don't measure up. That it's basically the same as cheating because, if you look at a woman with lust, that the women are abused and disempowered and all these things. So porn was bad. You shouldn't look at it. It shouldn't exist, blah, blah, blah. And then now I make porn. So clearly my mind has changed about pornography. Um, yeah, I mean, and I think honestly, what began that, and it was all part of a theme of being really controlling and being really jealous as I was when I was married,
Or maybe
and
being a little bit insecure. Would you?
super insecure, very insecure, absolutely. Very insecure, very jealous, very controlling. And told that my husband's attraction for me was this very delicate thing that could be disrupted by a girl in our church dressing immodestly, or me gaining weight, or me not putting effort into dressing up, or his coworker flirting with him, or him looking at pornography. All these things were these big threats to my husband's ability to be attracted to me sexually, which is freaking hilarious for several reasons. But one of the main ones is that it's actually, on average, heterosexual women in long-term monogamous relationships who lose sexual interest in their partner before men do. So it was actually my attraction to him that the church would have been worried about if they were going to have their worry based on any kind of research or data or reality, but whatever. So yeah, and then I got into polyamory, and that really started to erode my assumptions around monogamy and jealousy and the finitude of attraction or love or care. And then I spent a lot of time in libertarianism, and based on my libertarianism, I thought, well, sex work should obviously be legal. And based on my sex positivity, sex work is ethically permissible. And why would porn be different? And then I started looking into the research on pornography in terms of its social ills. And does it really ruin marriages? Is it really particularly addictive? Does it make men more violent? Does it make men more sexist? Does it cause men to objectify women? All of these things. And as I looked into the research, I'm like, nope, 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 nope. It's not harmful for the
All right,
vast majority.
Let's delve into that. So one argument, a lot of arguments against porn, I think, have been advocated by both conservatives and progressives nowadays. So one argument would be that porn consumption leads to men degrading and objectifying women and often seeing women in a much more sexualized way, which is bad. What would you say to that argument?
It's false. It's unequivocally, there are a lot of questions in science that are very ambiguous. This one is not. Watching pornography does not make the vast majority of viewers more misogynistic. In fact, some studies show that men who watch more pornography are actually more gender egalitarian, hold more gender egalitarian views than men who watch less pornography. It does not make men hate women or, view women in a worse way. That just doesn't happen. Like, it's not true. There is a small subset of men who are predisposed to be misogynistic and violent toward women, and those men, some portion of those men enjoy misogynistic, violent pornography and will watch it, a lot of it, and will go on to harm women. But that's true of like men who are predisposed to violence generally. They will often watch a lot of violent movies and then go on to commit violence. But that's neither here nor there to whether watching violent movies has led to people being more violent on average. And in fact,
maybe it's led to the most predisposed people becoming more violent on average. Would you concede that point?
Um, possibly, yeah, that's possible. But that's really neither here nor there to like how we should feel about violent movies generally and what's to be done about them and how they impact people generally speaking. And I will say that as pornography became more widely available through the internet, violence against women plummeted. So violence in America hit a peak around the 90s, which is around when pornography started coming online, and has declined pretty steadily since then as pornography has gotten more ubiquitous. So if pornography makes men more violent, riddle me that. I don't really understand how that's going to work.
All right, what about the argument that like consuming porn leads to men becoming a lot more lonely and a lot more insecure, and like they lose a lot of self-esteem, and it makes them more afraid of entering into relationships because it has an effect on their sense of self-worth? What would you say to that argument?
I would say that one has more merit than the violent one. But again, I think we need to separate cause and effect. I think that there's, again, very little evidence that for the vast majority of men, pornography has any influence on their loneliness. I don't believe that pornography is causing male loneliness. Like, I just don't see any evidence for that whatsoever.
Not even like a small, not even like a small level of causation.
No, I don't think so. I'm open to evidence. If somebody wants to show a small causal effect or wants to point me to a study that shows a small causal effect, you can. I am familiar with data from like David Artur, for example, that shows that there has risen since the financial crisis, so like 2008, a cohort of prime age men who are not in education, not in employment, not in training, and who basically stay in their parents' basements and watch pornography and play video games. But again, we've had internet pornography. We had internet pornography before the financial crisis. We didn't see it until the financial crisis. If there weren't pornography, there's no evidence that they wouldn't just be using that time to play video games. I'm not seeing the causation. Now, is there a small subset of the porn-consuming population who might otherwise be more social, but are spending hours and hours a day watching pornography? I'm sure. Those people certainly exist. I'm not convinced they wouldn't be addicted to video games or gambling or whatever, something else. I don't think porn is causing their problems. And I think one of the main ways that we know that porn is not causing these problems is that when you look at the main factors associated with when someone says they have a problem with pornography, it's not time spent watching pornography. That correlates very weakly with a self-reported porn addiction. What correlates very strongly with a self-reported porn addiction is shame around watching pornography. So that's telling.
Okay, but you would at least agree there is a strong correlation between pornography usage and like negative social conditions and circumstances, like how likely you are to feel insecure or lonely with yourself, or even like how likely you are to no.
Porn use does not correlate strongly with feeling bad about yourself or being.
All right. Would you mind if I just quoted the American the American Survey Center of like Daniel Cox's polling thing? I'll just quote it and then I'll hear your interpretation of it. Quote, men who report having watched pornography recently report the highest rates of loneliness. 60% of men who watched pornography in the past 24 hours say that they have felt lonely or isolated at least once in the past week. In contrast, fewer than 4 in 10 men who have never watched pornography and 49% of men who have watched it but not in the past 24 hours say that they have felt lonely in the past week. I can see you like moving your face around as if you really want to say something. Okay, let me just say one more paragraph and then I'll let you chime in. Men who watch pornography regularly are also more likely to report they frequently feel insecure. 74% of men who report having watched pornography in the past 24 hours say they have felt self-conscious or insecure in the past week. Only 45% of men who say they have never watched pornography say the same. Dude, I'm guessing you have something to say. You can chime in if you don't, or I can just read a few more paragraphs. All right. How about this? I'll say one last paragraph then.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Pornography may also contribute to men feeling less satisfied with their sex lives. Only about a quarter of men who report having watched porn in the past day say they are completely or very satisfied with their sex lives, compared to 41% who say they have never watched porn. The findings here are not conclusive evidence that pornography is causing these problems. Rather, these results show a strong relationship between pornography use and a variety of negative social conditions and circumstances. So would you agree there's a correlation, or would you reject that premise as well?
I mean, I don't know what study, I haven't seen the study, but based on what you're saying and my memory of it, I have several things to say. I mean, one is that there are also studies showing that men who watch pornography, okay. One thing that's difficult about this is that people aren't honest about their porn consumption always because it's very stigmatized.
Preference falsification, yeah.
I am very skeptical about this percentage of men who has never watched pornography. Like, okay, sir, sure. I wonder about the people who admit to it versus the people who don't. But putting all that aside, I've also found studies that show that people who watch pornography, again, are more likely to hold more gender egalitarian views and also are more likely to be in a relationship and more likely to have had sex in the past week. So to me, what I have understood from the sex researchers that I follow is that the most close tie between pornography consumption and some kind of, descriptor of a person is libido. People who watch more pornography tend to have higher libidos than people who watch less pornography.
Yeah, and do you believe that's causal?
No. I mean, I think the libido causes the porn consumption, if that's what you're asking.
Keep going.
Yeah. So no, I don't think that porn causes people to be lonely or have less sex, because if it did, we wouldn't see the tie between the positive correlation between watching pornography and being in a relationship and having sex. Now, as far as the other way, I think that loneliness can cause porn consumption, right? Because if you're lonely, you're by yourself often. And if you're by yourself, you're probably doing things to amuse yourself. And one of the things you're probably doing to amuse yourself is watching pornography. But to say the pornography is causing the loneliness, I don't see evidence for that.
Okay. So what would you say? Do you think that both progressives and conservatives do too much to condemn like porn usage?
I mean, yeah, absolutely. Like, it's so stupid. That again, the evidence that pornography is causing social problems on a mass scale is extreme. I mean, and people are looking for it. Evangelical groups are funding studies and like funding researchers and trying to prove that pornography is causing all these social problems, and they're having a hell of a time because it's probably not. Whereas we have real problems impacting men. Like, men really are young. A lot of young men really are lonely. They really are out of the workforce, not in training. They're falling behind in school. They're, much more likely to die deaths of despair.
Yeah. They're less likely to get married or even get into a relationship because of the decline in dating rates.
exactly. Like there are real social problems impacting men. Pornography is not among them, but it's a very easy scapegoat, and it's a very easy way to avoid doing any of the things that might actually benefit men, that might, I don't know, have any impact on the way our politics or economics or, anything that the people who are currently benefiting from the status quo might be invested in. We'll just go after porn. Like, that's very convenient for them.
Do you think that people on, I don't know, either side of the political spectrum, but like for now, just say, let's say the right, do you think they're using porn as a scapegoat?
Yes. Yes, they are very clearly using porn as a scapegoat, for sure. Porn and pornographers and porn actresses and people who are already marginalized and stigmatized in society make very easy scapegoats, as do all sexual minorities, uh, trans people, sex workers, queer people. Yeah, they're all very useful scapegoats for the people who want to pretend to be doing something for marginalized people while actually protecting the status quo.
This is, I find this fascinating. What is your, explain to the audience what your experience is with sex work.
Well, I started as a sugar baby in my late 20s.
Explain what that means.
Oh, okay. A sugar baby is a kind of sex work that exists in a more gray area between uh, economic dating, and it's essentially more explicit, slightly more explicitly economic dating. So it's a beauty status trade pairing, which is just a little more explicit, where a woman generally, not always, dates a man generally, but not always, who has money and either buys gifts for the sugar baby, the sugar daddy, gifts or cash or some kind of compensation for her time and sexual access to her.
All right, so yeah, explain more about what your experience was like with that.
Well, I think I did sugar babying as opposed to escorting because it was basically the same as dating, except, instead of asking my boyfriend for money, it was more upfront, um, more predictable. Uh,
And maybe it gave you a sense of structure.
for sure. I like things to be explicit. That really appeals to me about sex work. Um, yeah, so I did that for a while, on and off for many years. And it was never my primary source of income. And I liked aspects of it and didn't like aspects of it. And then I started doing OnlyFans in the pandemic, actually, and took a couple years off and have restarted my OnlyFans. So my OnlyFans is, I make pornography, make and sell pornography on OnlyFans. I think, yeah, I mean, that's basically my experience with sex work.
Yeah.
Oh, and I do advocacy for sex workers, of course.
What do you think about the argument that sex work is like degrading towards women?
I mean, okay. I don't even know where to start with it. I mean, is sex degrading towards women? I can respect that argument a lot better than I can respect the argument that the explicit trade of sex for money is inherently degrading. That just doesn't even make yeah, it doesn't even make sense to me. I think in a world where we shame sex and we see women as lesser, then it kind of feels like it makes an intuitive sense. But once you actually start to question, like, is sex shameful? Are women lesser? Then it really falls apart. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, you don't think there are elements of it that might be either implicitly or explicitly exploitative towards women and their desires.
Exploitation is about power. If I don't have a lot of choices, it's exploitative to make me scrub a toilet. If I don't want to scrub a toilet, but I'm having to do it to eat, that's exploitative. But to say that it's more exploitative or it's more degrading for me to suck a dick than to clean a toilet is stupid. Like, that is dumb. It doesn't make any sense. It only makes sense if you think sucking a dick is shameful. But I don't. I don't think either sucking a dick or cleaning a toilet are inherently shameful. I don't think there's anything wrong with either activity. And I don't think that women are somehow incapable of consenting to cleaning a toilet to survive, but not to sucking a dick. And to think that is incredibly demeaning to women. And so that's what's degrading to women. That's what's demeaning to women, to say, I can consent to cleaning a toilet, but I can't consent to sucking a dick. The dick isn't magic. And my brain doesn't break when it comes into the picture.
Aren't there progressives who make that argument?
Yes, and they are extremely misogynistic to make that argument. Like, that is an inherently misogynistic argument, whether it's coming from the left or the right.
Yeah, but I think that there is a progressive feminist argument that, like, a lot of the time women are, like, incapable of consenting.
Right.
Like, yeah, because
it's
like
infantilizing.
Yeah, well, they would say, like, it's a product of socialization, and you might say that it's infantilizing. And I have my
Both
own.
could be true.
I have my own opinion about this, but I personally think that you have to emphasize, like, one of those two. You have to either say that it's like,
But you don't. You don't have to say it's one of those two. You can acknowledge that certain things in our society make it more difficult for women to assert ourselves when it comes to sex, for example. And that despite these limitations, despite our infantilization, despite the stigma we have around sex, women are still also adults capable of making decisions. And that, yeah, it's not exactly the same to suck a dick and to clean a toilet because we have stigmatized sex far more than we've stigmatized toilets. But it's also not magic. Like, women are also still capable, despite these limitations, of making these choices. It's a both and. And, like, that's difficult. It's more complicated. It's more nuanced, but it's true.
But maybe then, like, if we were to, like, extrapolate that from that, like, the argument that progressives make, the argument that you would characterize as misogynistic, maybe it places too much of the blame and too much of the responsibility on men to just, like, constantly try to, like, mind read the desires of women that aren't willing to, like, explicitly state their desires, even when there isn't an imbalance of power in that regard.
Yeah, I think that's true.
Yeah. Anyway, so, like, we spend so much time talking about this. Let's move on. So I think there's been a little bit of an undercurrent. There's been a little bit of an undercurrent in our discussion about how, like reactionary men. I've talked about this before on the podcast, but I think I'm gonna ask this question. Apologies to the audience if you feel like you've heard this too many times, but I'm gonna ask it again. Do you think that liberals and progressives have been, like, conceding lower class men over to reactionaries? And if
Yes.
so, why?
For several reasons. One is that they're a lot more expensive to reach, in terms of, like, it's easier to get somebody who's, like, kind of already sympathetic to you, more sympathetic to you, than to get somebody who's less sympathetic to you, more sympathetic to you. I think the education divide and the geographic divide is a huge factor here, where the GOP has just gone really hard after rural people who tend to be less educated and
are less willing to respond to polls. So, like, the pollsters can't tell you, because, like, even when they try to control for, like, gaps in terms of who responds to polls, there's still like tons and tons of, like, conservatives that might have conservative leanings but are unwilling to say it to pollsters. So, like, as a result, it's very hard to get the educated, like, liberals to actually understand that they need to reach out to those people more, because the polls are telling you that you don't really need to.
Yeah, that's an interesting point. I think that's interesting. And I think that there's a lot of in-group signaling breaking more at 11 on both the left and the right. And that on the left, we have a tendency to want to be right. And right means not racist and sexist and, you know, all those things.
Yeah, like you're on the quote unquote right side of history.
Yes, exactly. I think progressives want to be on the right side of history, which is a beautiful and wonderful thing. But sometimes being on the right side of history is done in such a way that is alienating to people who might not be there yet, might not have the time and education and whatever it takes to be up on the latest signals to show that they're on the right side of history. Maybe they don't know that we refer to people who don't have housing as people who are unhoused versus homeless people, for example, right? Um, I think it can be alienating in terms of you will sometimes get pushback if you're on the left, if you associate with people who aren't signaling properly that they're on the right side of history. And I think all of this makes it harder to reach and dialogue effectively with bottom half men in the bottom half in terms of income and education.
Yeah. Yeah, you wrote one piece after the election that I thought was interesting where like imagine that there are podcasts where they're not explicitly political even if they make like political like right-wing coded remarks every now and then. You refer to them as like a literati podcasts where I'm sure if they heard you they would like possibly understandably consider you to be condescending towards them. But I want to hear
They
your
don't. They're
side.
not listening, are they? Are they listening? Because I don't. I want to go away from this if they're listening.
Probably
I know
this
they're
is
not reading me.
this is like I assume that my podcast is for people that like are very like really want to dive deep into the nuances of a topic. But if they are
Okay.
listening, maybe you should
Do something else.
yeah.
The next episode.
Yeah, or you can be frank with them about what you think about them, and then I can just like engage in respectability politics and like say that I disagree with you or whatever. Uh,
Okay. Well,
yeah, or
what
you're
about it?
huh?
What did you want to ask about the illiterati?
Um, describe the like what like describe the way that they're not explicitly political and like how they don't spend most of their time talking about politics, but every now and then they might make a political remark.
I mean, that's just data. I can't explain. I mean, that's just true. I mean, most people are not political. That's the first thing to know. Like most people do not spend their time listening to podcasts like this. They don't read about politics. They do not care. And God bless them. I think that's incredible. I think caring about politics is a bit of a mental illness, to be honest with you, because you will have to spend way more time just getting up to speed with what is happening and what's happened than you'll ever have any impact on what will happen next. Unlike pretty much any other aspect of your life, if you spend a lot of time getting up to, it doesn't take much time to get up to speed on like what's happening at your church or what's happening in your PTA or what's happening at your job. Like, and you get paid to do those things or you get friends out of the other things. And once you get up to speed, which again happens pretty quickly, you can very quickly have a big influence if you just show up and like say things and do things. Um, None of that's true in politics. And the whole point of politics is to fight. Like it's a fight for power. That's what politics is. So it attracts and retains kind of a maladjusted person, and I'm patient zero of this, so I can say it. Um,
I am as well, yeah. But
you know,
yeah. Maybe it would be productive for me to just like quit politics and just become like I take the bet like I try to figure out which democratic issues pull the best like social security or whatever, and then like I just spend like most of my day as a video game streamer instead, and like 10% of the time I bring up points about like how like Republicans want to take away your social security or something. Um, maybe
I
that
mean,
that
that's literally like what, sorry, hold on. That's literally what I'm planning to do because I think that's literally what Democrats should do. Like, Democrats need to be entertaining. We need to be fun. Like, I loved what your guest from the Young Men's Research Initiative was saying about how one of the reasons that Democrats don't come on the podcasts is that they're not fun.
Yeah.
And I think that
Yeah, like so maybe what you could do is you like become like a video game streamer or a movie critic where like 90% of the time you just talk about some fun pop culture thing, and then 10% of the time you insert a jab about how like Superman strongly supports women's rights or something. Um,
yeah, I'm not going to play video games for any amount of money, but I do want to talk about relationships. So I think that's going to be my hook is like sex and relationship advice. And then occasionally like a little politics, but
but
primarily
like,
as entertainment.
and you're not going to explicitly say that it's politics. It's more
Because
like
it won't be.
yeah, in the
No.
same way that Joe Rogan is not explicitly about politics.
Yeah, exactly. But better than Joe Rogan.
Yeah, but maybe if you were to like mostly talk about relationships and like occasionally make like a left-coded argument, you should like look deep into the polling, like look like very deep into like David Shore's polling about which things are like more popular with swing voters. So like like when you would every now and then like the 5% of the time when you insert like a left-wing remark, you would say something like a supporting women's rights, but you would avoid talking about like white fragility or any of like the woke-coded things that swing voters dislike. Um, and then from there, you might actually convince people. You might actually do more to convince people to vote for Democrats than like just like being very explicitly political all the time. Yeah.
Probably. Probably. Hopefully. I don't know. We'll see. The thing is, like, despite being the number 34 bestseller on Substack in the humor category, I am not the pinnacle of entertainment, right? Like, I think that there are other people who will do this better than me, and I hope that
Yeah.
they start. And that's what I'm really trying to do is just try to like, hey, I'm trying this. You should try it too. A bunch of us should try this until a few of us hit, and then we can
Yeah.
make a real
And we
difference.
should try, we should all like the whole thing about how structure like we humans crave a sense of structure because like it tells us what to do, right or wrong. But instead we should have like 1,000 different takes, like all of which like are anti-Trump coded in some way, and like but they all come from a different point of view. Where like it might be like thing A, thing B, thing C, and like some of them might like feel distasteful to the point of view of one person or another. But we should at least try to give like as many different kinds of like anti-Trump like messaging in not explicitly political like shows and series and then like obviously I think that maybe like the one good thing about following politics is that we know what specific types of polling are more popular with swing voters. So every time we make like a nominally left coded remark, it's something that is more popular with swing voters. Um, and then from there we probably have much more of an effect than like this specific podcast ever will. Yeah.
No, I think that's really like underrated on the left. Is that like there isn't a right way to do things. Like there are a lot of different ways to do good, and we need different people doing it different ways. And I think like I'm reading a book Kitty Stryker just wrote, and it's yet to come out, but I'm reading a review copy called Love Rebels, and I love it. I recommend it. And it's very much about you know, how not to burn out as a left-wing activist. And part of how you don't burn out is you don't do the thing that you think needs to be done the most. You do the thing that you have the interest and capacity to do.
The thing that gives you joy to do. Yeah.
Exactly. Like that's what you
Yeah.
do. And that's how create value. And that's what I realized at some point in my life was that I was doing what I thought, fit into my talents and where I would do the most good, but it was exhausting and infuriating to me. And so that I thought, I don't know that if I'm doing like 1% if I'm moving the world like 1% in one direction, but I'm miserable 50% of the time in my own life, that's a bad trade. And of course I can't move the world 1% in any direction. I'm not that powerful yet, but I can make myself miserable. I have a lot of power to do that. And it's also just like a bad model. Like one thing that's really upsetting about Democrats and liberals actually is that we are more miserable than Republicans
Yeah.
and conservatives on average. And so it's not a very good sales pitch to say like, we got it all figured out. We're miserable fucks.
That's a valid critique that conservatives have about us, is that we feel a lot more miserable than they do. Then maybe that's something that they are doing right.
They're doing something right. You can't argue with misery. So, yeah, I think it's something we should take into consideration.
Yeah. Cathy Reisenwitz, thank you so much for taking the time to come onto this podcast.
Thank you so much for having me, Andrew. It was a really fun discussion.
Thank you for listening. If you enjoyed this episode and would like to hear more, make sure to follow this podcast on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or anywhere else that you get your podcasts from. Until next time, goodbye.